After the company closed in 1913, most of the stock was presumed lost. Remarkably, 800 reels of Mitchell and Kenyon film came to light in a Blackburn basement in 1995. The footage, shot in and about Cork between 1901 and 1903, tells a story that sits uncomfortably with the politics of independence, a story that has remained largely untold ever since.
The power of the subsequent events must have been such that they remodelled what was happening and what we see in this film. They swept away that early 20th century British city with its Union Jacks and its passers-by.
Some 15 years before the Easter Rising, Mitchell and Kenyon recorded an altogether different Cork city to that of the martyred Lord Mayors Terence MacSweeney and Tomás McCurtain.
The reality was, I think, that there was a colossal amount of sheer acceptance of the prosperity that existed in a rather smug but very well provided for city in many ways.
This is not the city that traditionally Cork people would have learned about, either in school or from their grandparents or from history books. But it was there, it is a reality.
An evocation of ghosts teasing through the lens of Sagar Mitchell and James Kenyon atop the King Street tram in 1902. King, soon to be renamed McCurtain Street, in memory of a murdered Lord Mayor.
The story of the War of Independence, which was so much part of the story Cork tells itself about itself in my lifetime, we forget that over and against this uprising of the clerks and school teachers and factory workers and post office workers, there was a very strongly established and very prosperous and very fashionable middle class.
Looking at this very English-looking city with people dressed really like Edwardian, late Edwardian England, women with their wonderful hats, men in bowler hats and so on, it certainly challenged my idea of an Irish city at the start of the 20th century. And it is indistinguishable, I would think, from any British city, any provincial British city. You begin to wonder very fast, well, where did the Cork that possibly people of my generation grew up with, well, where did that come from?
Could this young cyclist have grown up to become a martyred Lord Mayor? Or could his bones lie scattered among the anonymous dead at Suvla Bay or Sudel Bar? Over whose shop did that Union Jack flutter? Does it matter? Did it matter then?
There's a very obvious and striking appearance of the Union Jack, which shocks us nowadays as being a sort of imperialist thing. Such manifestations of British rule were accepted and it caused very little shock.
Now Collins, then Victoria Barracks. And the Munster Fusiliers, just back from the Boer War, are cheered home to a man by Shawleys and street urchins alike.
Watching that raggle-taggle army straggling out of Victoria Barracks, as it was, it reminded me that in the late 70s I had a flat directly across from the officers' mess, aptly called, in Collins Barracks, as it had become. And there was an old woman there, very genteel, Dots was her name. She wouldn't go into the pub on her own, so she'd grab you in the shop and say, will you accompany me into the pub? And then, of course, they'd buy her a drink. But then, she was in then, but she had been brought in by a gentleman. I was passing for a gentleman in those days. But Dots' attitude was, you know, this was always a very loyal city. And she meant loyal to the British Empire. She'd never reconciled herself to the idea of independence whatsoever. She hankered after the soldiery.
I'd never marry a soldier, the sailor or a marine, but keep your eye in the Sinn Féin by with his yellow, white and green. So right away, so right away, so right away, Salonica, right away, me soldier by. 20
years after this film was shot, the Union Jack was the butcher's apron. You know, it was a symbol of revulsion. It was a symbol of an impediment to statehood. At the time, it was just the flag of the ruling power. It was just the flag of them, you know, the ones who run things. You look at that launch coming down the River Lee by the exhibition grounds and you think, yeah, well, it's a colourful flag. It's a decoration. You know, 20 years later, to go down the River Lee with a Union Jack flying off the flag, you'd need an escort of black and tans on both sides of the river. So in such a short time, such an enormous change can happen.
Do my thoughts in their fancy take flight to the home of my childhood away?
If you look at many of the main streets now and compare them to the representation that you get of them in this film, I would have to say that Cork looked more elegant and the streetscapes were less broken. There's a kind of fluidity and there's a language in the streetscapes, in the buildings, in the shops and so on, that we have lost.
I see my grandfather's face, the face of his friends. I see them as young men, my grandmother, my aunts, my own parents. I see their faces as children or as teenagers or as young adults or as elderly people all over these films, because there is a kind of a stock of faces that comes back, just as there's a stock of stories.
Grand Parade meets Washington Street at Singer's Corner, ever a lively hub of activity.
It was, of course, a very noisy city, certainly bustling and full of every kind of transport life, and in a sense, I think we can truly say, far more efficiently provided with public transport than we are today.
Nobody now alive could have been in any of those films. We are looking at the dead. But they were bustling about their lives. They weren't overcome by melancholy at the thought that they were mortal. They lived their lives with a kind of an open freedom.
There's a tram and a cart, I think, for example, which is a lovely kind of natural juxtaposition of two things, which gives extraordinary life to a street scene. The horse determined to go his own way, and the tram kind of having to deal with this. It's a wonderfully living moment that they have caused. And there are many of these, I think, that scatter throughout.
There's a wonderful scene of people coming out of the Lee Boot Company or Dwyer's or the Hanover, as it would have been called in Cork traditionally. These are names that have very, very strong resonances for anybody from Cork. But the crowd of people really pouring out at the end of a day's work, presumably the bell went off, they could all rush out and go home. And you have all social classes, you have people who are clearly workers, you have children who are workers. If you look at them and just say to yourself, how old are they? They look like 8, 9, 10-year-old children, members of the adult world already.
The great range of age. You have the youngsters, the young workers, the apprentices. It was an age, of course, of apprenticeship. And the more senior workers.
So you have child workers, you have adult workers, and then you have people in bowler hats who must have been foremen, who must have been maybe the directors, and there's at least one woman looking extremely elegant, and all of this together, a small world, but really the whole world.
I was very struck by the independence-mindedness of the odd character that you'd see in a film, spotting a camera. He struts across, the real, here's me. Do you know, there's a Cork type, like, you know, here's me. And this fellow walking out of the Lee Boot, for instance, and he's fixing the hard hat, you know. Now, he hasn't a clue what he looks like. He's never seen himself, but he's very keen on presenting the right image of himself, like, you know. And you look at him and say, this boy is up for anything.
Far from the world of factory workers, polite society drifts down from the laundered suburbs of Sunday's Well. Echoes of drawing room soirees about them and an assured sense of their place in an ordered world.
There's a bower of roses by Bendemeer stream, and and the nightingale sings round it all the day long. In the time of my childhood, 'twas like a sweet dream to sit in the roses and hear the bird song.
Merchant Prince Cork knew how to promenade among the right kind of people, of course.
Forget, but oh, when alone in the bloom of the year, I think is the nightingale singing there yet. Are the roses still bright by the calm Bendermere?
Where better to capture Cork people at their best than after Sunday Mass at St. Patrick's Church on the Lower Road.
Faith of our fathers living still, in spite of dungeon, fire and sword.
You look at the people coming out of St. Patrick's, and they walk out, they hang around on the steps, they talk to each other, some go off to buy the paper.
Everyone then, of course, looking their best and also proud to be doing their religious duties and to be seen and photographed doing them as well. So that not only did you do good, but you were seen to do good.
Respectable as St. Patrick's was, and indeed remains, a certain aura attaches to St. Mary's Pope's Quay that suggests it caters for a particularly refined congregation.
We're still in heart and conscience free.
Outside St. Mary's, people have their little carriages with their drivers, waiting for presumably to sweep them up into Shanakeel and Sunday as well. So even an innocent image, like here are people coming out of churches, it's not here are two congregations coming out of Catholic churches. Part of the social stratification of the city is laid bare. I'm sure they took a much better collection in St. Mary's.
The Cork and Muskerry Light Railway, serving Dunamore, Blarney, Coachford and Cork, has all but fallen out of folk memory. Mitchell and Kenyon's long-lost footage breathes new life into a dying legend.
I'm always amazed when I think of the transport situation because I was familiar with it at a sort of later stage when it survived really into the 30s. But Cork had so many railway stations, about 5 of them. It had a vast amount of horse traffic. You had the sound of the trams, the whining, the banging. You had then the rattle where I was at school. You had the rattle of the Muskerry dasher across the way at certain hours of the day.
If the Muskerry Dasher is nigh forgotten, the Muskerry Sportsman lives on.
Rambling for roving, for football and sporting, for drinking.
Signs of black porter perhaps in the demeanour of the jolly chap on the left.
Scoven, you'll find them so jovial as the Muskerry sportsman of old Teddy Quill. At the Cork exhibition there was a fair lady whose fortune exceeded $1 million or more.
Whatever about Thady Quill attending the Cork International Exhibition in 1902, Mitchell and Kenyon certainly did. A vast hymn to native industry, science and agriculture. Nothing on this scale has ever been attempted before or since on the banks of the Lee. The Irish wonder of the empire, the Cork exhibition was the brainchild of a much-loved Lord Mayor, Alderman Edward Fitzgerald.
There were great jokes, for example, about the Lord Mayor at the great exhibition, Fitzy, as he was known locally. But he was a very homely man, like, you know, they used to tell stories like that he was alleged to have addressed the Queen like, ate up your dinner, ma'am, no, you know.
Mitchell and Kenyon were in their element.
They're very interested in Cork people's interest in the public space. And they show a city where people seem to stand around a lot of the time, gawking at each other, and where they get a great sense of fun.
The international exhibition attracted peers of the realm, captains of industry, and the as yet largely loyal citizenry of Cork.
There's very much a sense of spectacle of people dressing themselves in order to show off, and the public space being used as a kind of stage, as a theatre, where people would perform, even if the performance meant simply walking up and down.
Cork society welcomed both the Commander-in-Chief of His Majesty's forces in Ireland, the Duke of Connaught, and a royal entourage led by Prince Henry of Prussia, visiting the exhibition in early summer 1902.
People who were also very conscious, middle class, who were very conscious of their status and of having arrived, and who are part of the kind of a royal setup in a sense, and would be turning out in their best on all these great public occasions to meet whoever was to be met, and preferably to be photographed doing so as well, as a mark of their arrival and of their status. So Cork had very much that kind of, I think, very self-satisfied social consciousness of achieved worth and achieved gentility.
That you loved me still the same, that you loved me still the same, that you loved.
Cork turned out in 1902 with the same enthusiasm for the symbols of empire it was later to display when welcoming such pillars of the Republic as W.T. Cosgrave and Eamon de Valera. Perhaps the most remarkable images filmed by Mitchell and Kenyon in Cork form a sequence which records the grand procession that marked the opening of the Great Exhibition in 1902. This arguably marks the high point of Edwardian film in Ireland as social and civic archaeology.
I often think of home on the air, when I am all alone and far away.
Anyone who was free at all headed off the minute there was a bit of excitement. But of course then, in some of these clips, we see the big formal, I think, procession with landaus and all the best people in their best attire and their tall hats. But I think they all turned out, you know, the trade unions with their big formal painted banners.
I mean, look at the doubting, quizzical expressions on the face of the factory workers, and look at the complacent faces of the Cork merchants and the aldermen and their ladies as they're driven by in carriages to be looked at. The camera picks out all faces equally. We all know how to present ourselves to a camera. In those days, it's as if those in power already knew how to present themselves. The poor were still dubious, though. What's this yoke? Who's this now taking advantage of me?
People, I think, had in Cork this a rather proud sense of occasion, and the march out to the Great Exhibition opening must certainly have been quite something to see.
There's one or two banners with the Irish language in them, and there it's still quaint, it's still touristic. 20 years later, a banner with a script in the Irish language is saying something entirely different. So these literally are signs and signifiers of who people were, but you can see the embryos of change to come.
Memories
It was the city, as it were, en fete. They were all out. They were there, they were entitled to be there, and they were going to have a damn good day.
To me throughout the night, all that light.
When we look back at our own place, you know, the place of our birth, the place that nurtured and shaped us, that gave us our accents, that gave us our ways of breathing, of walking in the street. I go back to Cork and see these same faces, but these faces belong to people who are long since gone. They're gone into dust. It's that curious comfort you get when you actually accept the truth of death as the thing that gives life its meaning.
Far up to heaven I will take my lay. The angels who will sing the holy air.
So the film is a kind of challenge to our collective sense of ourselves, and it's a challenge to us to remember how to love our place and how to love each other. Above all else, I think it's a reminder to us that we have to cherish the dead.
What survives of Mitchell and Kenyon's footage of Edwardian Cork was shot for profit, undiluted by political or propaganda imperative. If their cameras strayed into the festering poverty on either side of the river, those pictures have not survived. Nevertheless, these images inform our vision of Cork on the cusp of the 20th century. Waiting in the wings, both kings and kaisers and dreamers with guns would shatter this world forever.
It's like waking up one morning, going through a mirror into a city that at one level is very familiar because we can recognise Anglesey Street and so on and so on. But everything else is different, everything has changed. So there's a kind of a moving backwards and forwards through a mirror that makes it both real and unreal. And for me, this is what makes this film an absolute knockout.
When you look back at a piece of film like this, you are put in touch with the dead, and they are somehow brought back to life because you realise you're just an instant of the human condition. So there's comfort even as there's sorrow there.